Scholar and academic Gautam Chaubey is known for translating Pandey couple's Bhojpuri classic and iconic novel Fulsungi. Krishna Manavalli, who translated Chandrasekhar Kambar's two plays, has made the Kannada poet and playwright's creations accessible to English language readers with great skill and finesse. Himanshu S. Mahapatra is an academic, author, and a translator. They will discuss the art of translation and taking local stories global with edX's chief reporter Daniel Thimaya.
Today, joining us, we have two very illustrious people, two very illustrious academics. We have from Mysore right now, we have Krishna Manavalli, who's a professor in English. She's been very prolific with her work. She's been across continents. She's done a lot of research in various forms of writing. But I think somewhere along the line, the works of Chandrasekhar Kambar have sort of drawn her in. And that is why, with all of the work she's done with the Sahitya Academy's board and all of the translation she's done, she did this very beautiful bit of work called Karimai, which of course was an award-winning bit of work. It was published as Seagull. Many of you might have read this. If you haven't, I would totally recommend that you do. And thank you so much for being with us, Professor Krishna. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's wonderful to be here with you both. It's really great.
We also have with us Professor Gautam Chaubey, who's joining us now from the Atmaran Sanatan Dharma College in Delhi University. He's also a professor of English, but his cultural sensitivities are a little more north because he's the guy who brought us the enigmatic work of Pandey couples Full Sungi, which for those of you who follow Bhojpuri literature is probably one of the most definitive works ever written. We're going to ask him a little bit about that and how that process was of bringing that work to life in English so that a much larger audience can consume it. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. To begin with, when we talk about translation as a sort of genre within commercial writing, the question, of course, comes in, as academics, I think a lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of translation is sort of part and parcel of the work you do. But when you approach it as a sort of commercial project, how exactly does that work? And is there a difference in approach as opposed to your academic work? Professor Krishna?
Okay, now this is an interesting question. When you look at translation in the academic terms and when you look at translation in the so-called real world out there is the question that you're asking me. But I think they're both tied together to a very large extent because on the one hand, yeah, you are talking about translation theory and you're also engaging in approaches to translation, and academics has always been invested in this whole genre of translation for various reasons. Let me start talking about my own, multiple locations, which made me more and more aware of how translation or the notion of translations works within the academic field. For instance, I was teaching and I studied and I was teaching in the U.S. for a very long time, and I have taught here and have studied here in India too. So working across these multiple geocultural locations, there was something which struck me very, very strongly about the centrality of the act of translation within the academic field. For instance, there were courses like global literatures. And then we also taught stuff like post-colonial literatures. That's my specializations in a way. And the global literatures is a very interesting course which I encountered there. This idea of global literature springs from the importance, the centrality, the desire, and also the political correctness of reading literatures across different geocultural spaces, mainly non-western and post-colonial spaces. So when I was trying to teach these courses, one thing that I noticed, okay, that this idea of the global literatures, this umbrella term global literatures, and that is something true of post-colonial literatures too sometimes, tries to gather together a whole range of literatures across various non-Western geocultural spaces in one fell swoop. It's like an umbrella term. So what do you do there? How do you deal with this kind of homogenizing which happens? And one of the ways in which you can try to, like bring in heterogeneity is looking at literatures, native literatures, for instance, when you're talking about Indian literature, literatures in Indian languages. That's one of the things which I started with. And again, when you think about Indian literatures in these global contexts, global academic contexts, whether you're teaching global literatures or whether you're teaching post-colonial literatures, one thing that you find there is already an established canon. It's mostly, Indian writers writing in English. And then if you try to push that a bit, what do you get? You have writers who get translated into English, who find that kind of global limelight. But then again and again and again, you see the same star writers who become a part of this canon. They become enshrined in this canon. So, what happens to writers who come from different, like regions in India? What happens to, for instance, writers from southern part of India? That was a second question which I became deeply interested in as an academic in the US, because one of the things I did, especially for my doctoral research, and I've been invested in this research for a very long time, is work on South Indian cultural formations. So I started getting interested in looking at how writers from South Indian locations, especially writers from Canada, because this was the literature I was very, very close to all my life. Although my home language is Telugu, and I grew up, among languages like Telugu, English, and Kannada. Kannada literature is something which is very close to my heart. So what I found there was there are very few Kannada writers who surface in this global lit or post-colonial lit canon when you look at the international context. So, how are we thinking of the notion of Indianness, of Indian literature? Because very often we find that these ideas get defined in the academic circles outside India. So, what do you do? How do you think about the diverse literatures in Indian languages? And do they find the same kind of global visibility? These are the questions which set me thinking about translating from Indian languages and the rich oeuvre, the rich corpus of literature in Kannada, for instance. And then how do you bring that to global limelight, global visibility? Who are the writers who are getting translated? And who are the writers who remain invisible in this canon? How many South Indian writers, how many Kannada writers are getting translated? And if you kind of nuance this idea further, how many writers from the marginal caste or class locations from southern part of India get translated, and what kind of global visibility do they find? These were the questions which my academic investment in the translation area set me thinking. But when I started translating the writings of Kambar, who is one of the stalwart Kannada writers and perhaps is like the finest myth makers in this country today, he's a Gnanpith awardee, and interestingly, someone who goes back to his North Karnataka roots, the rich folk idiom and then the mythopoeic imagination. When I started thinking about these questions, I tried to begin translating Kambar. And what I found there was how do I bring the rhythms of this rich folk idiom into English? And that set me really, really into, like this challenge, this tightrope walk of trying to bring in that folk rhythms, those folk rhythms, that folk idiom, that language, and that whole sensibility, and the collective folk vision from which Kambar's writing springs. And I translated, for instance, in 2017, I translated Karimai, which won the state award, Siga, and then I translated Shivana Dangura, which is a novel which is again set in these kind of folk, ethos, but at the same time, it also talks about the ways in which the neo-colonial forces penetrate into even the small spaces, like the small places, the rural places of the third world or the non-Western countries. So here was another challenge I was dealing with. And after that, how do I translate them? How do I make them accessible to global readers? And what kind of global English should I, make use of, and at the same time bring in these rhythms, the Kannada rhythms, into my writing, and then bring in this vision of the writer to the larger international reader? These were the questions that I started, thinking of. So I was kind of moving away from the academic discourses a little bit. I was looking at the market. I was looking at the kind of publishing places which are invested in publishing translations, who get interested in publishing translation from southern Indian, like
No,
writers.
I think that's rightfully practical on your part, to have sort of looked at it from a very sort of publishing standpoint, because very often I found that academics they find it difficult to work with editors and publishers because they don't really like the fact that length is an issue. They don't really like that a lot of the suggestions that they give aren't very well taken in. That's what they tell me. Professor Chobe, if I could just bring you in there, you, of course, have you had a love affair with Bhojpuri literature. I suspect it's something that you grew up with. Why don't you tell us a little bit about about how you sort of got into that Zen frame of mind, and how you even thought to bring. I don't think anybody's ever brought Bhojpuri literature translation to the forefront until you actually got to that. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
My maternal grandfather was a Bhojpuri author of some repute. He wrote about 7, 8 novels and a couple of epic poems. Those are the conventions. If you're a Bhojpuri writer, you write an epic poem and you write a couple of plays, and then you produce your novels. He also wrote a couple of novels in Hindi, and my mother would read those stories out to him. His stories out to him when I was a kid. And those would be very fascinating because they would have, contrary to what I would read otherwise, names I could connect with. So they would have names of my village and names of people in my village, and very often the protagonist would be Gautam, characters. So my grandfather was very generous. We call him Nanaji, grandfather in North India. He was very kind, and I quite love those facts, and that this is a body of literature I can really connect with, and I find myself and my location being reflected in it. But then I never got to read much of it. I mean, I grew up with the stories, and I was familiar, and my mother used to read a lot. And then I came to Delhi, did my Delhi University, my graduation, post graduation, MPhil, PhD, and all of that. And in between, I thought of going back to because my PhD was on Hindi periodicals. My PhD was on late early 20th century Hindi periodicals. The way the whole nationalist debate was being thrashed out in public sphere through these periodicals. So I connected with a lot of these authors, and very often I would come across references of characters, of literary figures, of editors, who come from that region, and I would say, oh well, I know this person. He comes from this part of Bihar, and he's also written something in Bhojpuri. So my PhD work, it sort of reactivated to some extent my in a sense long forgotten engagement with Bhojpuri literature. And then as soon as I submitted my thesis, somebody thrust a copy of Fulsungi into my hand. Now the thing with Bhojpuri books are they're not very easily available. You have to reach out to the author. We don't have a market for them as such. Because Patna happens to be where most of the Bhojpuri authors converge. There are quite a few centers of Bhojpuri writing in India.
No, I dare say this is a common issue with a lot of Indian regional literature.
Yeah.
But I think we'll come to that a little later, please.
Yeah. But the problem in this case is more pronounced because we have Hindi. In the case of South India, it could be an English literary rival, but here we have Hindi, and those who read Bhojpuri or speak Bhojpuri are equally competent in Hindi. So this person gave me a copy of Fulsungi, and it was a spiral bound. It was an old spiral bound photostated copy, and I said, "Why don't you go ahead and translate it?" I read a few pages of the story, and it was difficult for me to read it in the first go because although I grew up speaking Bhojpuri, I'd never read Bhojpuri as much. And the literary Bhojpuri or the expressions, I grew up in a part of India which is on the border of Bihar and Jharkhand, now Jharkhand and Bengal. So it's Bokaro. So we have this river. You cross that river, you move into Bengal, and then here you have Jharkhand. So and then there are three successive stations, railway stations, all three in three different districts. you know so I grew up with this culture. We accumulated, as I told you, there were Telugu people, there were Marwadi people, there were Bengalis. So I accumulated quite a lot of those vocabularies, and the objects, the links for those objects. uh, and I found those objects identified differently in Bhojpuri, the literary Bhojpuri. So it was a bit of a challenge initially. So I just sat over it for about 7-8 months more, and then I started connecting with people who were quite active in the Bhojpuri field. So I started connecting with Bhojpuri authors, Bhojpuri critics, and most importantly, people in my village. I have a village in Bihar where my father lives now, but I grew up in Bokaro Steel City, which is quite a cosmopolitan kind of a place. Every good kid aspires to become an IITian. And if you really manage to do that, then you end up becoming an NRI. So those are the kind of ambitions we used to nurture. So growing up at that part of India, and then going back to the village after my father retired from his government job, was very different. So I never connected with my villagers, with people in my village in Bihar that well. But this novel allowed me, or in a sense provoked me to get back in touch with them. And uh, there were many words, there were many expressions which my aunt would explain to me. There were expressions and words which the farmer who has been working on a field for close to 5 decades now, he could explain those words to me. So it was initially very challenging, but then I got the sense that there is this community of Bhojpuri speakers and Bhojpuri enthusiasts, which includes both well-read literary critics and authors, but also the farmers, which includes filmmakers, but also the migrant laborers, and somehow all of them converged around it. And when I first shared the cover of this book on Facebook page, and I realized it was shared by people I hadn't even heard of, people I'd never met. There were people I'd met about a decade ago, or I had known, hadn't been in touch with for very long. They got back to me saying that I saw that poster, that cover of yours. It was posted by somebody. Well, I didn't know that person who had posted. So I felt that there's a community. There's a vernacular community which comprises not just the literary people, not just the professors, not just the linguists or language enthusiasts or activists, because Bhojpuri is struggling to find a place in the 8th schedule. But it also includes the diaspora. It also includes the migrant population. It also includes the farmers. And they were very thrilled that something which they felt was always neglected is now finding a place in the mainstream. So it was exciting, but initially, so now when I look back at the journey from those early days in childhood, when my mother would read those stories, to that one decade when I virtually lost all touch with Bhojpuri literature. And then once that spiral-bound photocopied book came back to me, so it's been various phases, but overall very satisfying. Yeah.
It's interesting that you brought up the point of pride, because I think linguistically, everybody who has a very strong base in appreciating regional writing, they've always enjoyed reading books in their own language. But I also think there's a deep amount of pride when somebody says, okay, I'm going to translate this book and we're going to take it to a larger audience. We're going to translate it into Hindi, we're going to translate it into Tamil, Telugu, every single language conceivable where we see a market. uh, Professor Manavalli, of course, you've you've been doing this for a while, and you've got a fair few books out. You have two plays now, which is out as well. uh, what is your primary experience in terms of how people receive these translations, and do you believe that it is an emerging market? Do you see the interest in translated works actually reaching the masses?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. Interestingly, when I was done with two plays and we were planning to launch the book, it was the time of the first lockdown. So all of us were so anxious, and then we did not know how the whole thing would pan out. I kept talking to the marketing person of Penguin, and we were trying to find new strategies, of course, like online strategies of launching this book. And then we were thinking of the various ways in which we could market this book. But believe me, I mean, after all, this was the time when because of the kind of alienation, because of the kind of loneliness, because of the kind of, the threatening atmosphere that we were all existing in during that first lockdown period. There was this, very strong urge to reach out, to speak, to communicate. And that was something fascinating, because right after the first lockdown, we found that even though we couldn't do a physical launch of the book, we had started marketing it, and there was a lot of publicity and the avalanche of reviews, and almost all the major online, as well as like major newspapers, and then the magazines which started pouring in. That was so heartening. And there were readers who were reaching out to us, and there were readers who were even talking to us directly. And the number of reviews which were written, that was something amazing. So it set me thinking, yeah, probably, translation, of course, I mean, it has been a powerful genre all through, but even during the pandemic times, how this translation, which I did, could reach out to so many people, gave me a lot of courage, and it made me feel like, yeah, translation is here now, and it has a central place in the publishing, as well as like in the literary market, and also in the manner in which people are receiving it. That is something very, very heartening,
It's
I
very
think.
heartening, I think,
Very
more than
heartening.
anything else. I think it's extremely
Yeah.
heartening.
Mhm.
Professor Chaube, this, of course, it was a 2003 movie, but this phrase lost in translation is something that every newspaper editor, sort of seems to love playing around with every time there's anything that rhymes with either lost or translation. But I'm guessing that when you are somebody who spends hours and months and weeks and possibly even years translating something that is considered epic in a regional language, I suppose that with great power comes a greater amount of responsibility.
And greater
Uh,
value.
yeah. So, how scary a thought is that, and how difficult is it to sort of weigh the pros and cons of translating, what is essentially considered an epic?
Yeah, you know, uh, well, that begs the question: what is a good translation? And the best way to answer that question would be to have the original and the translated, and tally the two. But then, what's the point of translating if you must do that? So of course there'll be something lost in translation, and that has become quite a cliche now. I mean, when somebody says, well, I said, oh, yeah, I know that. Let's get on to something more significant. The important thing here was, for me, to introduce certain objects, certain rituals, which are specific to the region, and then look for equivalents when the rituals or the words or the ideas were not so region specific. For example, there's this word called khoicha, right? Now, khoicha is literally, it means when a bride sets out of her mother's house and goes to the in-laws family, right? The mother gives her some gifts, and those gifts she's expected to tie in the flowing end of her sari. That's the anchal of the sari. Now, this is very typical of the region. So I had to find a way to retain this word by way of glossary, by way of, offering a quick sociological gloss embedded in the text itself, at times trying to strike a balance between the two ways. But then there were words which, for example, a word like mukhtar. Mukhtar is quite well known. Mukhtar is a common term in Bihar, but it's a common term, I guess, over across North India, right? And an average Hindi reader or whoever has read Premchand, even in translation, would know what the word means. So that was one fear. The other apprehension was to render the songs, because this deals with the life of a great poet. Mahendra Mishra is a folk legend, and his songs are still sung and extremely popular. I grew up singing a few of his songs. I guess most Biharis know his songs, because he spoke of love. He spoke mostly of migration. People who've gone to Calcutta and other places, and he would give expression to the anguish of the wives or the mothers, who were left behind in the villages. So it's very, very, very well known. So translating the poems was a bit of a risk.
Just to take the conversation forward from where Dr. Krishna let off, Orissa, of course, is another area adjoining where Mr. Professor Chaube is from. And he's talked to us a lot about how the the intricacies of every dialect and every, small group of people changes. And that is one of the greatest challenges to translation. When it comes to somebody's work, like Jagdish Mohanty's work, which again
Mhm.
is very, very highly regarded, what were the biggest challenges that you had when you translated this novel?
Yeah.
And what was the kind of reception that you had afterward?
Okay. So thank you, Daniel, and let me say hello to Krishna and Gautam. Um, you know, I'm also an English academic, but I'm a retired professor of English. And in fact, my translational journey began just about a decade ago. I'm not very very old in this field. Uh, I have translated Nija Nija Panipatha, but it is not yet published. It is accepted by Penguin, and it is due out in 2021. It's because of the COVID-19 pandemic that the book could not be published in 2020. But then the first translation that I did, and let me just make it clear here, that I translate with a collaborator. Uh, in both the translations, I have a collaborator, and this collaborator is from Canada. His name is Paul St. Pierre. So together with Paul, we translated an Odia novel called Basanti. It's a novel that was written in the 1930s. It was first published serially, and then it came out as a book in 1931. So this is a unique novel in the entire corpus of Odia literature and also in Indian literature, because it was written by 9 writers working together. It was one novel, but it was written collaboratively, and 9 writers were involved, 6 men and 3 women. And they wanted to write a feminist novel, a woman-oriented novel. They wanted to write a novel which would make a case for female identity. So this is the first novel that we translated. It was published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. And the second novel is Battles of Our Own by Jagadish Mohanty. Now, since you asked me about Jagadish Mohanty, let me tell you that Jagadish Mohanty is a modern Odia writer, but he has been writing, all his stories and novels are based in the Western Odisha, in the coal fields and the coal mines and the mining region of Western Odisha. So it's a very remote.
I'm led to understand that they're industrial pot boilers, and there's a lot
Yes,
of
yes,
workers'
yes,
issues that are dealt with in the book.
yes. That's right. That's right. So it is an industrial novel, but the novel is just not an industrial novel. It's just not about trade unionism. It's just not about workers, the conflict between the management and the workers. It is also about Mohanty's ability to transform this industrial landscape in the direction of existentialism. He takes this theme from existentialist literature about man's basic alienation, man's basic, quest for meaning in a world which, he's a stranger to. So he brings this dimension from existentialism and tries to see in the industrial man a prototype for the existentialist man. So this is another thing. And the third thing, of course, is that in this novel, Mohanty is not entirely projecting a Marxist dialectic case. It's not actually Marxist rhetoric that governs this novel. As a matter of fact, there is a lot of disenchantment with the Marxist rhetoric. So he brings in this working class hero who finally believes that, that a moral resistance is ultimately more important. So I think in this novel, you have this coal mine setting, that is one dimension of it. And there is this, the existentialist insights from literature of, of the 1960s Camus, Kafka, Beckett. And there is this emphasis on the Gandhian values. So all these are put into mix in this novel. So in the process, we get a very unique industrial novel in English literature, I mean, in Indian literature.
Professor Manavalli, I mean, in your experience, again, in the context of when you're dealing with books that have been so highly regarded and, they've been awarded so much and read by millions of people in a regional language, of course, there is this very incorrect perception that people think, Acha, you're translating it. What's the big deal? You're probably going to run it through Google Translate and like run, Grammarly through it. Which is probably the most unkind thing that anybody could say to somebody who spent hours and hours and hours researching it. But in reality, what are the most difficult parts? What are the most complex, the most challenging aspects of translating something that is set in a different era, that has different societal constructs, that can have entirely controversial aspects when you're setting it in something, when you're translating it and bringing it for a modern audience?
Okay, let me briefly go back to the idea that we were discussing a little earlier, and Professor Chobe also dealt with that idea, and I think in a very fascinating manner. Now, thinking about translation as loss, that is something which I find really problematic. I mean, I wouldn't look at translation as an activity which you have to see in terms of the profit or loss log book. No, it's not that at all. Translation for me is half the time as creative as creative writing itself. It's a very creative activity. I see it more in terms of a trans creation. So this is where you start thinking about it. And one of the things that I find very challenging in dealing with the writer, like Kambar, for instance, a folk writer, a writer, or any writer who goes back to the rhythms of the native language. The problem there is to bring the rhythm, the musicality of that language. And how do you do that is my main question. But the other kinds of problems, like talking about lexis, vocabulary, talking about terms, talking about cultural specific terms, these are another problem to deal with. I'm looking at it both in terms of language itself, the musicality of language, especially when you're dealing with the folk verse and the folk poem, the poetry that seeps into almost all writings of Kambar or any folk writer, because even folk prose writing has so much of poetry in it. So that is where you start thinking about this idea of what to do with culture specific terms, if that is what we are dealing with at the moment. Well, I'm a translator, not an ethnographer. I am not a native informant. And what I try to do here is try to steer clear of an Orientalist approach. Well, there is always this problem of giving yard long notes or going on giving exhaustive kind of glossaries. I don't think I would like to do that. And as Professor Chobe also pointed out, I try to bring in these cultural specific terms and then their meanings in text. I try to do that in text as much as possible, and then keep the, like the glossaries and then the footnote part of it as limited, and minimal as possible. Now, another problem here is if you go on, thinking about bringing in these culture specificity and then forgetting all about the target language and forget all about the fluidity, which is and the flow, which is so important for translation. And if you lose the sense of the target language that you are dealing with, of course, the other problem is, if you are trying to plunge into some street smart American language to make it, to familiarize it to your American reader, that is a problem, yes. But on the other hand, to get into glib exoticism, that is another deeper problem that I see. So I try to engage with these terms. I use various strategies, various approaches, and I'd love to read a little bit of what I have translated. I think that in itself would, be, obvious. It would reveal the kind of strategies I use when I come up against such problems like culture specificity, for instance, and then the linguistic, specificity of a particular, language writer, the language culture, and the literary culture which is rooted in that language. Yeah, these are the things that I have to deal with too. Now, another thing is the whole paradigm I use here, the metaphor that I use here is that of music. For me, how do you render a raga, for instance? You just have to soak yourself into that whole tradition. And when you sing that raga, it becomes your own, and it's still rooted in the tradition, isn't it? That's what I try to do with translation too. You soak yourself into the over of the writer and that linguistic culture and the, like the literary culture from which this particular text springs. And then I start translating. So I use various approaches, but one of the things I really believe in is the reader is also somebody who participates in making meaning. So I am not going to turn into an ethnographer. That is one thing I really, really store that.
Yeah, and I think there's a
Mhm.
there's a huge amount of like you say, there's as much as one would be loath to say so. I think there's a lot of individuality that goes into the process,
Oh, yeah.
because you are taking calls that and that is why your name is on that cover. You know, because there is a great amount of responsibility that comes with it. Mr.
Uh,
Himanshu, what was your
yeah.
one big takeaway from the process of translating this novel? I mean, what did it leave you with?
Well, I think it basically uh, you know made us look at the process in which we can take the context in Odia, the specific industrial milieu in Odia, into English, because you know the terms that Mohanty uses, they're of English origin. They are very common. But then for most urban readers, these terms actually do not have a referent. They cannot really correlate with anything, correlate these terms. Like, for example, take the case of Holles drummer, take the case of wagoner, Holles drummer, tub checker, tub rider, dresser, timberman, overman, mining sardar. This is a whole battery of industrial terms. These are English. So when we translate them into English, but we are not able to correlate them with their reference. So it's very difficult. Without visualizing it, it is very difficult to translate it, because ultimately it becomes a meaningless exercise. So in translating this, we had to actually consult people who work in the coal mining area. I'll give you just one example. In the very beginning of the novel, he's describing workers, miners going into the tunnel, into the pit. And then there is this idea, there is this reference to, the person is issuing every miner who goes down what is called a C form. C, a capital, as in letter C, form. Now, what is a C form? I didn't know this. Now, I could simply write, he was bent over his C form, or he handed everyone a C form. But what is a C form? Well, then I talked to people who work in coal fields, who work in coal mines, and one of them told me that a C form is one that is issued to a person who goes down. And when he comes out, he also hands it over to the at the counter. So this is how, this is one aspect of of translating
It,
this
it,
novel.
it, it goes to show, of course, that the amount of research that goes into translation
Yeah,
isn't as
yeah,
easy as it sounds.
yeah,
This is something that we've been discussing.
yeah,
Just to very quickly, go back to one of our points and probably put a finer point on this discussion.
yeah.
Professor Krishna had mentioned that you know it is a point of concern and great worry for every academic as to
Hmm,
how much of literary wealth there is out there in every regional Indian language,
true.
especially those who are probably marginalized,
Hmm,
that one could possibly see as lost, or one could also see as an opportunity for translation.
hmm.
Professor Krishna, how do you see this, and do you see a solution for this? I'll then, pose the same question to Professor Chobe and Mr. Himanshu.
Okay.
I think it's an absolutely important question because the when you think about, for instance, I was talking about how the idea of Indianness or Indian literature gets projected in national and international contexts. A whole lot of times we see that again and again and again, there is a kind of either a homogenization which doesn't take into account the diverse and very rich literary traditions and plural literary traditions that we have in this country. And I am on the English Advisory Board of the Central Sahitya Academy. And one of the things we are very majorly concerned about is, apart from translating works into English, Indian works into English, we are also deeply invested in translations among Indian languages, because there is this kind of dialogue, this kind of conversation, which is absolutely necessary when you think of what your idea of Indian literature is and how you bring in all these diverse strands of Indian literature into your notion of quote unquote Indian literature. And the next question is, how do you disseminate this idea in the global context? What is Indian literature? And how do you bring in all these very, very disparate and very, very rich linguistic and literary cultures into that idea of Indian and Indian literature? That is something that we have to try very hard. We have to really try, and I think translation definitely is a very important activity which has been doing this. And the role of translation in bringing this kind of a cross-cultural conversation is very, very important. If I interpreted your question right, is that what you were talking about?
Yes, yes. I also, of course, asked if you see it as an opportunity for us to tap these riches,
Oh yeah.
uh, or if you
Yes.
see it as something that's a bit of a, it's a tragedy because there's so much out there, and there's so very much that we haven't even scratched the surface of. Uh,
Right.
Professor Chaube, do you see it as an opportunity, or do you see it as something that we've
Definitely,
lost out on?
definitely. With Fulsungi, because this is the first ever translation of a Bhojpuri work, a full-length translation of a Bhojpuri book. The primary task was introducing it to the readers, also to the publishers, because nothing is possible without their cooperation, tell them that there exists a body of literature that remains largely untranslated and is fairly exciting. Now, having done that, suggestions start pouring in. People who write in Bhojpuri, or people whose fathers or grandparents used to write in Bhojpuri. Now they're getting in touch with me, sending me copies of their books, asking me if I can translate them. That's one. But then, of course, so it's an opportunity, to bring out a body of literature, to see the cultural resources, that remain trapped in that body of literature, untranslated, to bring it to the forefront. But it also allows me to read around it. So when I'm looking at Bhojpuri literature, I'm also looking at not just the marginal characters. I'm also working on a history of Bhojpuri literature. This is an ongoing project. So I'm looking at a lot of marginal characters, and not all of them are deeply invested in Bhojpuri literature. Some of them very quickly, very early in their literary careers, switch to Hindi. Then there are others who write both in Hindi and Bhojpuri, and then there are others who combine the two. So when the news came out of Fulsungi's translation, somebody got in touch with me and said, "Why don't you look at a man called Gopal Ram Gehmari?" Now, Gopal Ram Gehmari lived in a place next to my village. He comes from Gehmar, which is considered the largest village in Asia. I mean, it held that record till some time later and has now become substance of legend in that area. Now, Gopal Ram Gehmari was such a phenomenal figure and has been largely overlooked. He introduces the detective fiction genre in Hindi. He's the first detective fiction writer in Hindi, and based in Gehmar, he used to bring out a periodical called Jasoos, which literally means detective, and he edited that periodical for close to 40 years. So my engagement with Bhojpuri, of course, it allows me to engage with the other Bhojpuri authors, right? On account of my reading of Pandey Kapil, because I knew works of my own grandfather. Now, because people are sending their books to me, or books written by their grandparents to me, but it also allows me to read around. And so now I'm also thinking of writing something on Gopal Ram Gehmari, at least, journal length article to begin with, but maybe, in near future, translate something of it.
I hope it also encourages more people to, sort of enter that realm and, want to translate. Because, whether or not it makes it to the big leagues, I think the little guy also deserves a chance, as Professor Krishna pointed out very succinctly. Mr. Himanshu with the last word.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's a very interesting question that you asked. I mean, it's true that every regional literature is replete with treasures, with lots of riches. But I, as a translator, wouldn't like to engage in a kind of indiscriminate translation. I think that not all works need to be translated. Some works don't deserve to be translated. So a translator has to have a very fine sense of discrimination and has to really select works which stand out, by using, if you take different parameters, for example, Gautam talked about, this Bhojpuri writer who introduced the first detective fiction or the detective, first figure of the detective. So,
I'm very excited about that, by the way. I'd love to, read
yes,
a lot more about it.
Me too. I mean, I also know that in Odia, there is a writer who first introduced the genre of the detective novel, a person called Chandramani Das. He was the person who introduced the genre of detective novel. I mean, my choice of Basanti was because it is the first and the last exemplar of the collective collaborative novel in Odia. There are examples in Bengali, but they have not been actually brought to limelight. Jagdish Mohanty wrote the first industrial novel in Odia. So I'll be interested in looking for novels, looking for stories, looking for literary works, which would in fact break new grounds in different areas, in different genres. And for example, I'm more interested in dead authors than in living authors. That's another of my. I'm more interested in
I don't know if publishers see that as a selling point, but I kind of get where you're coming from.
Yeah,
I think it's great that I think that a lot of the sense of where I'm going is that I'm getting from all three of you is that translation is intensely individual, it's intensely research oriented, and I think it's about giving all of that great regional writing what we now call the glocal edge, keeping it local while taking it global. So thank you very much. You've been absolutely fabulous. Thank you for a stimulating conversation.
Thank
I
you.
look forward
Thank
to
you,
reading
Daniel.
all of your work. I wish you all the best. Do stay safe during this time. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
Thank you, Daniel.
And thanks to Krishna
Thank you,
and
Professor
Gautam
Chaubey.
as well.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. Thank you, Professor Himanshu.